Chapter 18. The Great Exodus. How the European monarchies are salvaging their plunder. There exists an old Dutch proverb, passed down from generation to generation in the House of Orange-Nassau, not as folklore, but as a survival manual. It runs roughly as follows. God created the world, and the Dutch created Holland. But a wise Dutchman keeps his money not at home, but where neither God, nor king, nor tax collector can reach it. And if you think that anything has changed over the intervening centuries, permit me to disabuse you. Only the number of zeros on the accounts has changed, and the marques of the armored cars in which one drives up to those accounts. The preceding chapters of this book were devoted to the anatomy of the crime. We have established who, when, and in what manner stole the thrones. We have calculated how much the maintenance of these usurpers costs each year. We have shown the contrast between their luxury and the poverty of their subjects. Now the time has come to pose the most practical, the most cynical, and perhaps the most important question. Where is all this wealth located right now? And what do its owners plan to do with it when their houses of cards begin to collapse? The answer to this question is no idle curiosity. It is the key to understanding why the European monarchies still exist and why their fall, however inevitable it may be, may turn out to be not a final sentence, but merely a change of scenery for the selfsame actors. 18.1. The Swiss Vault. No accident, but a project. Let us begin with the obvious, of which people prefer not to speak aloud. Where do the European monarchs keep their money? Not in the banks of their own countries. That would be far too risky. Any parliamentary inquiry, any journalistic investigation, any popular uprising, and the accounts could be frozen, seized, or, God forbid, subjected to taxation. No, the real money, the family silver, the rainy day fund. All of this has flowed for centuries to a single destination. A country that has no outlet to the sea, no natural resources, no pretensions to geopolitical influence, and whose army, by and large, is needed only to blow up bridges and tunnels in the event of invasion. Switzerland. This was no accident. The Swiss Confederation in its modern form is not so much a state as a financial offshore, created and sustained over centuries by the European elites for the safekeeping of their capital. The famous Swiss Banking Act, which came into force in 1934 and made the disclosure of depositor information a criminal offense, was not adopted to protect the savings of Swiss burghers. It was adopted so that French aristocrats fleeing the guillotine, German industrialists escaping reparations, and, of course, the royal houses of Europe could sleep peacefully, knowing that their millions were securely sheltered from the eyes of tax authorities and revolutionary masses. The most vivid example is Prince Bernhard, father of Queen Beatrix and husband of Queen Juliana. This bon vivant, a Nazi functionary in his youth and an influential member of the Bilderberg Club in his maturity, was exposed in 1976 for receiving multi-million bribes from the American aerospace corporation Lockheed. And where, do you suppose, were these commissions kept? Naturally, in secret Swiss accounts. Bernhard was no exception. He was the rule. His case merely confirmed what everyone had long known. Switzerland is the collective safe deposit box of the European aristocracy, their common purse, concealed within an alpine fold. 18.2. The Digital Apocalypse. Why the Swiss haven is doomed. This perfectly calibrated mechanism, which served faithfully for more than one generation of usurpers, has suffered its first serious malfunction. And this malfunction is connected not with war, not with revolution, but with a quiet, barely perceptible to the layman, yet tectonic in its consequences, technological and political transformation. The world has begun to fragment inexorably into closed macro-financial zones, and anonymous banknotes and deposits are giving way to what financiers call by the fearsome abbreviation CBDC, central bank digital currencies. For those accustomed to thinking in the categories of cash in an envelope or a numbered account in Zurich, CBDC is a death sentence. Because a digital currency is not simply electronic money. It is programmable money. Every transaction conducted with it is visible to the issuer, the state. Every account can be frozen, restricted in its use, or subjected to compulsory taxation by a single command from the center. In a world where CBDCs hold sway, the anonymity of financial transactions vanishes as a phenomenon. And along with it vanishes the very raison d'etre of the Swiss banking system in its present form. Switzerland faces a murderous choice. Either it completely renounces its centuries-old tradition of banking secrecy and integrates into the global system of digital currencies, becoming as transparent as glass, in which case all of its clients, including the royal houses, will be fully visible to the tax authorities of their home countries. Or Switzerland attempts to preserve the remnants of anonymity, in which case it will be disconnected from the principal payment arteries of the world. Its banks will be unable to conduct transactions in euros or dollars, and its entire financial industry will collapse overnight. In either of these scenarios, the role of Switzerland as a safe haven for dubious royal capital will be annihilated. The question is not whether this will happen, but when precisely, and whether the rats will manage to abandon the sinking ship. 18.3. Where to flee. An analysis of dead ends and the sole exit. And here the most interesting part begins. In parallel with the agony of the monarchies themselves, whose collapse in the coming years is preordained by history, economics, and the law of Ibn Khaldun, their owners and their family offices, those inconspicuous firms in Geneva and Zug that manage billions, are already tackling a second, no less critical task, the salvation of assets. The flight of capital from the doomed Swiss haven is no matter of idle curiosity, but a pressing necessity. Where, then, can these funds be directed? Let us conduct a brief but ruthless analysis of possible refuges, immediately discarding the untenable options. Stocks, bonds, debentures, and other paper assets. This is not even discussed. Under the conditions of an impending world war, the fragmentation of the global economy, and a crisis that promises to eclipse 1929 in scale, the stock market is not a refuge, but a meat grinder. Corporate profits will collapse, sovereign debts will be restructured or written off, and stock market indices will enter a steep dive. To hold money in equities and bonds at such a time is tantamount to keeping one's savings in a burning house. Real estate. Palaces in Europe, estates in Transylvania, villas on the Côte d'Azur, mansions in London. All of this is transforming from an asset into a burden. In conditions of war, economic collapse, and popular unrest, real estate can be neither swiftly sold nor protected from expropriation or pogroms. Moreover, luxury real estate is a screaming asset, one that draws attention and makes its owner a target. In an era when even the Rothschilds and Rockefellers have begun to divest themselves of their art collections, a tendency noted as far back as 6 or 7 years ago, clinging to palaces is a sign not of status, but of stupidity. Cash currencies. Pointless. First, the physical volumes of large sums make their transportation and storage exceedingly difficult. Second, in the era of CBDC, cash will be rapidly withdrawn from circulation and devalued. Third, any large sum of hard currency is an immediate trigger for law enforcement agencies. Diamonds, precious stones, luxury goods. Illiquid. Subjective valuation. Problems with transportation and certification. In crisis conditions, it is practically impossible to sell a diamond necklace for its true value. This is an asset for peacetime, not for evacuation. By a process of elimination, we arrive at the sole remaining candidate, that which has for centuries served as the universal measure of wealth and is dependent upon no one's digital commands, nor upon credit ratings, nor upon political regimes. Physical gold. Only that. And the circumstantial evidence, those very quiet signals that smart money sends to those who know how to listen, confirms the exodus into gold has already begun. It is by this, and by nothing else, that one can explain the colossal and, from the standpoint of official statistics, inexplicable influx of physical gold into Switzerland from London and New York, observed in the years 2023 to 2025. The major holders were not buying paper gold in the form of exchange-traded ETFs. They were not speculating with futures. They were physically transporting bullion. They were retrieving their metal from vaults that seemed to them unreliable and bringing it to Switzerland, not as a final destination, but as a transshipment base, a place from which to make the last, decisive dash. 18.4. The antipodes as the last redoubt, Australia and New Zealand. Where, then, will this gold go when Switzerland itself collapses? It will not remain in Europe, which will be transformed into a zone of military operations and economic depression. It will not go to the USA, whose jurisdiction grows ever more aggressive and whose tax legislation ever more draconian. It will not go to Asia, where China holds sway, with its own designs upon the wealth of others. And it will most certainly not go to Africa or South America, too unstable, too risky. The most realistic, almost preordained scenario is the Antipodean route, flight to Australia and New Zealand. These countries, situated on the far side of the globe, far removed from the principal theaters of military action, possess a series of advantages that are priceless for fugitives. First, the legal system. Both Australia and New Zealand live by British common law, which has polished its mechanisms for the protection of private property over centuries. For those accustomed to English law, this is a familiar and comfortable environment. Second, historical and dynastic ties. Let us not forget that the British monarch formally remains, to this day, the head of these states. The Windsors and their distant relations hold landed estates there, connections among the local elite, and contacts that have been cultivated for decades. This is no foreign territory. It is the distant frontier of their own, albeit spectral, empire. Third, geographical remoteness and reputation. In the event of a global conflict, Australia and New Zealand are far less likely to become a direct arena of military operations. This is an ideal place to ride out the storm, preserving the remnants of capital and influence. The transfer of gold there is a logistically complex task, yet one entirely solvable for those who have spent centuries perfecting the routes for the removal of wealth from the colonies. Maritime containers, private charter flights, diplomatic pouches, the arsenal of means available to family offices is sufficiently broad. Several tons of gold in kilogram bars do not occupy as much space as one might imagine. A single standard pallet holds about a ton. Thus, to export even a very large fortune, no armada of trucks is required. 18.5. A memorandum for those who do not wish to be left fools. This analysis would be incomplete were we to limit ourselves merely to a statement of facts. The book you hold in your hands is not simply an historical investigation. It is a weapon, and, like any weapon, it must be employed. The channel described above is not simply a financial scheme. It is a life raft for a criminal regime. While the peoples of Europe tighten their belts, pay rapacious taxes, and, perhaps, shed their blood upon the fields of battle, their lawful monarchs will quietly, methodically, and without superfluous noise, be exporting the wealth plundered over centuries to the far side of the world, so that there, in silence and tranquility, beneath the shade of British law and far from the people's wrath, they may continue their parasitic life in exile. Closing off this channel is not a question of political preferences. It is a question of national security and elementary justice. Any government that truly concerns itself with the national interest and not with preserving the privileges of a handful of usurpers is obliged to take measures. The tracking of large transactions in gold and silver, the monitoring of capital flows between Switzerland and the Antipodean destination, the compulsory disclosure of information on the ultimate beneficial owners of offshore trusts and foundations. All of this must become tasks of the highest priority. The monarchies shall fall. This is inevitable, but their gold and silver must not sail away after them, because it is not their gold and not their silver. It is gold and silver stolen from a multitude of peoples, and it must remain where it was stolen, to serve, at last, not the luxury of parasites, but the good of those who created it by their labor.